August 18, 2010. Early morning heat already pressing down on Vortex Spring in north-central Florida. A bowl of green water sits at the edge of a small park, sunlight catching on the surface. Divers are moving slowly around the basin. Fins, tanks, the hush of people who know there's an opening beneath the calm. In the middle of that quiet, a man named Ben McDaniel prepares to go down. He straps on his gear with practiced hands, checks his regulators, listens to the world compress into the small business of breathing. He wades in, then slips beneath the glassy surface. The top of the spring narrows into a ledge, then into a tunnel. The light behind him shrinks and then is gone. He is seen entering the cave. He disappears. No bubbles come up where he went. No sound at the surface. Only the slow chattering among the bystanders. Hours later, teams of cave divers will penetrate the darkness below, searching for a body that, even after repeated, exhaustive searches, is not recovered. How can someone vanish inside a place that was searched again and again? How can you not find what you are looking for when the searchers are the people who know the place best? Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Claire Huxley. This is a podcast about cases that leave gaps. Cases where official explanations meet stubborn uncertainties, where people are missing and the record is scattered, contradictory, or incomplete. We take a careful, evidence-minded approach, reconstructing timelines, talking to specialists, and, when possible, listening to the people closest to the case. We do this without sensational music, without doing mental leaps. We center curiosity and respect. Today, we return to the disappearance of Ben McDaniel at Vortex Spring, a case that has stayed alive in diving communities, in forums, and in a family's unanswered questions for more than a decade. In today's episode, I'll walk you through who Ben was, the place he dove, the last day we can trace him, the search that followed, and the competing theories people have proposed. We'll be joined through the episode by Dr. Marcus Ellison. Marcus is a veteran cave diver and a researcher into diving safety who consults with law enforcement on underwater search operations. He'll help us understand what cave systems like Vortex are actually like and what searchers can and can't reasonably do. Our goal is not to pick a winner among theories, but to map evidence, distinguish solid facts from rumor, and lay out the real gaps. We'll also spend time on the human cost, what it means for Ben's family to live without answers. Before we begin, a note. If you have information related to this case, please contact law enforcement. If you want to discuss the episode, do so respectfully. The people involved are real people and deserve care, not wild speculation. So, who was Ben? Let's move beyond the missing person poster and build a portrait. Ben McDaniel was 29 when he vanished. He grew up in Tennessee, described by people who knew him as bright, curious, and restless. He loved being in the water. Diving had become a major part of his life. He wasn't just a casual swimmer. He was someone who chased technical dives and challenging environments. Friends and acquaintances spoke of him in the years before 2010 as determined, sometimes impulsive, someone who looked for deep experiences in both his personal life and his hobbies. There was pain in his life, too. Ben's younger brother, Paul, had died several years earlier, an event that family members say affected him deeply. He also had financial struggles. He'd divorced and had business difficulties. People who knew him say that Florida represented an opportunity, a place where he could start over or at least escape the pressing complications of his life at the time. Vortex Spring, for a lot of divers, is a place that can feel like that, a site for renewal, for pushing personal limits, or for simply losing yourself in a narrow, oxygen-rich world below the surface. But Ben was not a simple figure. In the record, you find competing impressions. To some, a talented and driven diver. To others, a man who took risks and sometimes cut corners. His family remembers his warmth, his humor, and the parts of him that had nothing to do with diving. He had friends who set up a memorial and who raise questions about the events of August 18th to this day. When we talk about missing person cases, we have a responsibility to remember the person behind the headlines, their relationships, disappointments, and the whole of their life, not just the moment they vanish. To help us understand the place where Ben disappeared, I want to bring in Marcus now. Marcus, thank you for being here.
Claire, thanks for having me. I'm glad to talk about this carefully. Vortex Spring is a complex and, frankly, dangerous place if it's treated like any ordinary swim spot. It's a spring-fed pool with a basin that's open and inviting on top. But underneath, there's a cave system, a mapped cavern, and a continuation that leads into narrow, sinuous passages, some mapped, some not. The immediate area we should picture is a wide eyeball of water that drops into a ledge. There's an initial cavern zone where light still reaches and where recreational divers often stay. But past the gated area, the cave goes into a restricted, overhead environment. That means the ceiling is solid rock. You can't go straight up to the surface if things go wrong. That's a fundamental distinction. In open water diving, you can ascend vertically in many places and reach air. In cave diving beyond the cavern zone, you can't. There are mapped passages, which have been surveyed by experienced cave teams, and there are sections that are less well explored, either because they're tight, silted, or dangerous. The site management had safety mechanisms: a gate separating the recreational area from the cave entrance, signs warning uncertified divers, and a culture where the expectation is if you go beyond that gate, you're a certified cave diver with the right training and redundant gear. But gates can be opened, signs can be ignored, and people sometimes make the calculation, rightly or wrongly, that they can handle more than their training allows. The cave itself has silt, narrow restrictions, and strong psychological effects when you're in near complete darkness. All of those factors shape what searchers can and can't do.
Marcus, when people hear gated, they sometimes imagine a sealed steel door no one can get through. In practice, what does gated mean at Vortex? How easy is it for someone to pass that point?
It varies over time and by site management. At some springs, gated can mean a metal bar or chain, sometimes even a padlocked gate. At Vortex, the gate was a chain and post arrangement, something meant to discourage casual access, not a military-grade barrier. It's not impenetrable. A determined or experienced diver can get past it physically. Sometimes people go around it or remove it. The intent is to slow people down and signal, "Don't go in here unless you're trained." It's a clear marker of a transition from relatively safe recreational diving to an overhead technical environment.
Let's talk about the culture of cave diving. How are divers certified, and why do uncertified divers ever go past those markers?
Certification involves staged training, confined water exercises, skills for line laying, emergency procedures, gas management, and gradually increasing penetration under supervision. You don't just become a cave diver overnight. Yet, despite that, people sometimes push past their certification for reasons that sound familiar in other high-risk activities. A mixture of curiosity, confidence, the desire to prove oneself, and sometimes financial or social pressure. At the same time, we should avoid caricature. Many experienced cave divers are careful, methodical, and conservative. But the record shows that, historically, a portion of cave diving incidents involve people who were undertrained or who violated basic limits.
Thank you. That helps set the scene. Now, let's reconstruct that last day as clearly as we can. Ben arrived in Florida earlier in August, making his way to Vortex over the days prior. On August 18th, multiple people reported seeing him around the property and at the dive shop. Witnesses said he seemed determined to dive. Reports indicate that Ben either entered the water alone or with minimal company. There are versions. Some witnesses say he was alone, others say he had companions who turned back. The one consistent thread is he was last seen entering the cave. The exact time of his submersion is uncertain, depending on which account you read. He does not resurface. At what point do people realize he hasn't come back up? And what happens next?
From accounts, when a diver does not resurface within a reasonable window and there's no sign of an emergency at the surface, the initial reaction is alarm, but not panic. People will start to search the basin visually, call for assistance, and contact property management and emergency services. In Ben's case, local divers and then specialized cave teams mobilized. Law enforcement and the dive community coordinated search efforts over multiple days. Cave divers, some of them highly experienced, penetrated the system to the extent they judged it safe and necessary. They followed guideline into restrictive passages, feeling their way through silt-laden tubes. The initial days of search are intense. They focus on the mapped areas most likely to conceal a body.
Were there any early anomalies? Anything that complicated the search from the outset?
A few factors complicate searches generally. Water clarity changes, silt becomes disturbed, currents can shift small items, and the fault lines in memory create conflicting timelines. Specifically in Ben's case, part of the difficulty has been that nothing definitive, no body, no equipment conclusively tied to him was recovered in the sections that were searched most thoroughly. That absence of physical evidence in an environment where experienced divers were searching deeply fuels a lot of the questions and theories that followed.
Let's pause for a moment. Marcus, I want to underline something you said earlier about the cave being an overhead environment beyond the cavern zone. That's critical, because in those spaces, you're not one mistake away from a surface escape. You're inside a solid rock roof. For listeners who are picturing an open underwater tunnel with air pockets, that's not what we're talking about. It's enclosed, disorienting, and in some places, impossibly tight.
Exactly. And when you're in silt, a thin stroke can destroy visibility for a long distance. That's why cave divers use reels and guidelines. If a diver loses a guideline in a tight, silted passage, their chances of finding their way back through zero visibility drops precipitously. Those are the mechanics, the practicalities. They don't answer every question in Ben's case, but they show why going into a cave without redundancy and training is dangerous, and why searches are methodical and slow.
Now to the search itself. Over the days and weeks after August 18th, teams of cave divers, many of them volunteers from the cave diving community, entered the system. They reported penetrating mapped passages and some unmapped extensions. They felt their way through, laying line, probing restrictions, sometimes squeezing through areas only inches wide. They described silt, restricted visibility, and time-consuming progress. Despite those efforts, nobody brought a body out. I want to be precise here because this is where the record often blurs into speculation. There are credible, documented search efforts by experienced cave divers who reached substantial distances within the system. But there are different reports about how thorough those searches were in specific, tight, unmapped offshoots. Some divers who participated later said they left no stone unturned in the logical paths. Others cautioned that some blind restrictions remain, areas you simply can't reach without an unacceptable risk to more divers. The difference between searched and absolutely every inch probed matters, and people sometimes conflate the two.
Yes, nuance matters. A practical search strategy is twofold. Search where someone is most likely to be, based on the last known route and the limits of their training and equipment. And respect the boundary where continuing the search puts more people at risk. If a passage is so small that only a person of narrow frame with the right gear could get through, that's a place searchers will try. But at some point, you have to weigh the diminishing returns against the chance of losing additional rescuers. In a lot of incidents, if a body isn't found in the primary continuation lines, there are plausible spaces where a person could be lodged and not recovered without a very extended, high-risk operation.
That reality, the fact that some regions are effectively off-limits or extremely risky to re-enter, is part of why voices in the diving community who say he can't be in the cave are met with skepticism by families who see the system as unsearchable in parts. The search teams did deep, professional work, but even professional teams sometimes stop short of the most dangerous penetrations. That's a crucial tension in the case. Which brings us to competing theories. There are, essentially, three main lines people point to. Accident, where Ben died in the cave and his body wasn't recovered. Foul play, on or near Vortex. And an intentional disappearance. We will lay each out carefully and weigh the arguments, and Marcus will help clarify the diving-specific points. Theory 1. Cave diving accident and unrecovered body. The case for this is straightforward. Ben was last seen entering the cave, he had experience diving, and caves are dangerous. Silt could have been kicked up, a restriction could have trapped him, he could have run out of gas or had an equipment failure. The argument against this is the breadth of the search and statements from some highly respected cave divers who believe it's unlikely his body remains in the searched areas of the system. Marcus, how plausible is it that a body could remain in the cave despite the searches?
It's plausible for a few reasons. 1. Cave systems are three-dimensional labyrinths. There are small side passages, rock falls, squeezes, and buried tubes where a body could fall or be lodged. 2. Silt and sediment can conceal things. A body accelerated into a restriction may be lodged in a way that makes recovery impossible without removing rock or widening passages, which carries huge risk. 3. Initial search teams may assume certain lines would be traveled by a diver in distress, yet an unconscious or panicked diver may take an unexpected path. So even with excellent searches, especially when you add the variable of time, where currents or biological decomposition might move things, a body can be missed. That said, if large, accessible continuities were searched thoroughly and no gear or evidence was found there, that reduces the probability he was in those primary passages.
Okay, theory 2, foul play. Some people have suggested that Ben may have been harmed on the property or elsewhere, and that his body was never placed in the cave. Motives suggested publicly have included conflicts, debts, and interpersonal disputes. Questions sometimes arise about access to the site, footage, and inconsistencies in witness statements. Marcus, from a cave diving perspective, how do such theories interact with the physical evidence or lack thereof?
Foul play theory is outside my primary expertise, but I can say from a physical perspective, if there had been a violent event on the surface, you would expect either forensic traces near where it occurred or items connected to Ben to be found: clothing, blood, disturbed gear, or witnesses reporting an altercation. If an assault took place and a body was moved into the cave by others, that would leave different kinds of evidence. A sled or a line commonly used to pull things into tight passages, or perhaps gear moved in a distinct way. The absence of clear surface forensic evidence makes foul play harder to prove from purely physical logs, but it does not rule it out. Many foul play disappearances leave minimal trace, especially if delayed.
And then Theory 3, intentional disappearance. Some point to financial difficulties, the desire to escape, and the fact that he had no body to bury as supporting the possibility he left intentionally. Arguments against that include the difficulty of vanishing without leaving a paper trail or without being seen by someone, especially in an age of electronic records and surveillance. Marcus, any thoughts on this that connect to the diving facts?
From a diving angle, if someone planned to disappear at a water site, they could stage a dive and then simply not return, making it look like an accident. But that requires a number of factors. The person has to be determined and probably have a plan for quickly leaving the area without being detained or noticed, and they'd need to escape financial and social dependencies. It's possible, but harder than people sometimes assume. The modern world makes total erasure difficult. Also, staging a disappearance through a cave carries risks for the person attempting it. The worst of all worlds would be to try to fake an accident and then actually die doing so.
We should be mindful here. Each theory has gaps. Accident inside the cave explains the last seen facts, but is complicated by the lack of a body. Foul play explains an absence of in-cave remains, but requires an explanation for both motive and the lack of physical trace. Intentional disappearance needs motive and planning that the record doesn't clearly show. None of these is tidy. Let's step back now and do a systematic review of the specific pieces of evidence and the uncertainties attached to them. I'll read the item, and Marcus, when relevant, you'll help unpack the significance. Security footage. There are reports of limited or missing footage from cameras around Vortex on the day Ben disappeared. In some versions, relevant recordings were not preserved or were found to be incomplete. How does the presence or absence of clear footage affect what we can say about the timeline?
Footage is a linchpin in many modern investigations. If camera angles exist that capture ingress and egress routes, and they're missing or incomplete, that creates uncertainty. It can mean simply that the systems weren't recording or that tapes were recycled, a mundane but impactful reality. Or it might mean that footage is held by authorities and not released publicly to protect the investigation. The practical consequence? Without clear, continuous footage, building a minute-by-minute timeline relies on human memory, which is fallible.
Next, access to the gate and whether someone other than Ben could have entered or moved past it. We mentioned it's not impenetrable. Witness reports vary about who was around, who might have let people in, or whether the gate was open. How should listeners weigh that ambiguity?
Ambiguity should cauterize certainty. If multiple people could have accessed the cave, then alternate scenarios become possible. But the physical mechanics remain. Someone moving past the gate is not, by itself, evidence of foul play. It simply expands the set of people who could have entered the overhead environment. The critical follow-up is, are there records of who was present that day? Are there witnesses who can corroborate movements and times? When that record is thin, speculation fills the gaps.
Gear and vehicle. There are reports about what was left behind and what was not. Ben's car was found on site, I believe. There are conflicting accounts about what gear was present and whether anything was missing. The absence of his body, and in particular the absence of certain gear, has been used to support different theories. Marcus?
In diving incidents, we often look for regulators, tanks, lights, and any personal effects that would indicate a diver's last moments. If gear is missing, there are legitimate questions. Did he swim out without it? Was it moved? Or did he not need it because he was doing something else? None of those answers jump immediately from the material record without corroboration. And, of course, if gear is found deep within a cave and tied to a specific person through serial numbers or unique modifications, that would be strong evidence. Without that, it's more ambiguous.
Finally, in evidence, the statements from law enforcement and from the diving community and the family. Often those statements differ in tone and conclusion. Law enforcement publicly labels the case missing person and has at times suggested ideas known to them. Divers make technical claims based on their searches. The family has pushed for answers and also shared doubts about aspects of the official narrative. It's important to keep these layers separate when we're weighing evidence. Marcus, can you help parse the significance of respected cave divers publicly saying they think Ben isn't in the cave? How should listeners reconcile that with the fact that the family and some others remain unconvinced?
Respected cave divers can make reasoned judgments based on where they looked and what they saw. If the people most qualified to know the cave say, "We couldn't find him, and we think he wouldn't be in the places we searched," that's an important data point. But it's not definitive. There are always unknowns in a cave: micro passages, collapsed tubes, and areas that can't be safely entered. Families have a different calculus. Their need for closure and their lived experience make them focus on possibilities practitioners discount. Both perspectives are sincere, but they answer different questions. What did the search teams find? Versus what are all possible explanations for his disappearance?
Let's talk about the family. Ben's family has fought for answers, made public statements, offered rewards, and criticized handling of the case at times. They lived through the immediate trauma of his disappearance, then the prolonged, ambiguous grief of not having a body and not having a clear narrative. For many families, explained and unexplained elements coexist. They may cooperate with authorities while also pursuing their own inquiries or pressing public pressure. We must handle this carefully. The McDaniel family has asked for more information and, at times, expressed distrust of certain authorities or actors. That distrust is not unusual when people feel the person they love has been inadequately accounted for. At the same time, families are not infallible sources. They grieve, and grief can shape memory. That doesn't delegitimize their questions, but it does mean we must corroborate. Empathy doesn't mean foregoing rigor.
And Claire, from my experience consulting on recoveries, the emotional energy that families bring is crucial. They push for further searches, keep cases alive, and sometimes motivate re-examination of evidence. But that emotional energy also collides with operational realities: budgets, diver safety, and legal thresholds for reopening search operations. It's a painful balance.
Which brings us to an ethical consideration I want to make explicit. Cases like this exist at the intersection of curiosity and exploitation. The internet does something odd. It amplifies every plausible alternative and turns circumstantial gaps into conspiracy. People start identifying suspects on forums and social media, and sometimes real people get caught in that crossfire. We should be clear. In the absence of conclusive evidence, publicly accusing named individuals has consequences. Families deserve support and answers, but strangers deserve fairness. So when we talk about theories, we do so to map uncertainty, not to assign blame. Similarly, there's a responsibility for us, for journalists and podcasters, to avoid turning living people into villains or suspects solely to fill narrative needs. Our work is to illuminate, to ask which pieces of evidence would change the balance, and to show where we are guessing versus where we have documentation. Let's return to the central unanswered questions. First, is it plausible that Ben's body is still in the cave, somewhere beyond the passages searched? Marcus.
It is plausible, yes. Not guaranteed, not more likely than all other possibilities combined, but plausible. Cave systems are treacherous and three-dimensional. A body can be lodged in a way that makes recovery impractical. Silt and collapses can conceal things for a long time. That plausibility persists even when excellent divers find nothing in primary passages.
Second, if the body is not in the cave, what fits the facts? Foul play could explain surface absence, but it requires some physical trace to be compelling. Intentional disappearance requires motive and planning we don't strongly see in the record. So the question becomes, what additional evidence would move us from possible to probable for any of these theories? In my view, and this is important, those would include new, credible surveillance footage, a previously withheld or lost piece of physical evidence, a credible, corroborated eyewitness account of events incompatible with the cave death theory, or, conversely, the recovery of remains that can be forensically linked to Ben. Third, what about for the family? What would change their lived reality? For most families, nothing short of the recovery of remains or a verifiable admission by someone with direct knowledge will bring the kind of closure that allows traditional mourning to proceed. That's part of the cruelty of unresolved disappearances.
Clear? Can I add something? In other cases where remains are ultimately recovered, it's often because of some new piece of information. A hiker finds a shoe, a homeowner remembers an odd person on their property, a camera that was previously overlooked is located. Cases that seem frozen sometimes unfreeze because of small, seemingly mundane things. That's why it's important for communities to stay vigilant and for tip lines to remain accessible.
Which leads to our practical segment, how listeners can engage responsibly. If you have credible information, contact the law enforcement agency listed on public case pages. Don't post accusations on social media. If you want to help the family, consider donations to verified legal funds or organizations that support missing persons' families. Follow reputable reporting, and be mindful that spreading unverified claims harms real people. We'll put links to official channels and case records in the episode notes. If you're a journalist or a researcher and you have access to material that could clarify timelines and you're willing to share it with authorities, please do. But the internet is not a substitute for a methodical re-examination by investigators. Before we close, Marcus, I want to ask you to speak directly to listeners who may not understand cave diving. What would you want people to take away about the risks involved and the nature of searches?
First, cave diving is a specialized, technical pursuit. Training exists because the environment is unforgiving. Second, searches are thorough but not infinite. Searchers balance the imperative to find a missing person with the duty to keep rescuers alive. Third, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but absence also doesn't equal conspiracy. We should hold uncertainty without converting it into certainty about blame. Finally, if someone is considering entering an overhead environment without proper training, don't. Not because I want to be sanctimonious, but because it can kill you, and it can leave others to shoulder the aftermath.
Those are sober words. Thank you. As we come to a close, let me summarize what remains unanswered in this case. We still don't have a conclusive location of Ben's remains. We don't have public, definitive footage that nails down every movement on August 18th. We have no confession, no recovered body, and no single piece of evidence that conclusively eliminates one theory in favor of another. What we do have is a documented last scene, a substantial search by experienced divers, and a family whose life has been reordered by ambiguity. We also have a broader lesson about unsolved disappearances. Sometimes the facts won't line up neatly. Human beings find patterns. Our minds prefer clean narratives. But in many cases, the honest answer is we don't know yet. That discomfort is part of what drives people to dig deeper. And it's also a reason to be careful in how we dig. If you want to read more about the sources we used for this episode, police reports, public interviews, statements from divers, and publicly available family statements, we've collected what we could find and we'll link it in the episode notes. We also list the official tip line for the law enforcement agency handling inquiries. If you have something concrete, contact them, not us, not a forum. Not a forum. Marcus, any final thoughts for our listeners?
Only this, Claire. Treat missing persons cases with patience and humility. For those of us who dive, and for those who simply care about truth, the temptation is to fill gaps with stories. Instead, let's remain open to new facts and to the possibility that sometimes the simplest explanation, a tragic accident, is also the hardest thing to accept.
Thank you, Marcus. And to the listeners, thank you for joining us in a conversation that is quiet for a reason. This is not sensational material. It's the work of sifting detail from noise and respecting the people who are still waiting for answers. Ben McDaniel was more than a case file. He was someone's brother, son, and friend. We will keep watching for new information, and if the record changes, we will revisit it here with the same care. That's all for this episode of Still Unanswered. You can find our show notes, source list, and official contact information at our website. If you follow cases like this, please do it thoughtfully. And remember the human at the center. For now, the question that opened this episode remains: how can someone vanish in a place that has been searched again and again? We don't have a final answer. We have resumes of good work, contradictory memories, and a family waiting. Thank you for listening. I'm Claire Huxley. This is Still Unanswered.